Hello and welcome to the Project Doctor podcast. My name is Ralph Goossens and I'm your project management expert, presenting you with all the things you need to know about project management. Project Doctor is here to provide you with expert analysis and with recipes that you can put to practical use immediately after the podcast, so stay tuned. I'm very glad to hear that so many of you have already shown up, so let's get started right away. This is episode 12 of the podcast series, where I talk about the project canvas. The canvas is a map of the project landscape, and it's divided into 12 tiles. I've described it in full in the first episode of this series, and you can download the map as a picture from projectdoctor.online. In this 12th episode, I'm going to talk about third parties in the project. Have you ever been surprised by resistance coming from an unexpected direction? Have you experienced a sudden realization that your project is impacting groups of people that you hadn't taken into account initially? Then keep listening, and I will share some insights and practical advice for you. Also, don't forget to go to projectdoctor.online to download the extras for this episode and listen to the other episodes in this series about the project canvas. Most every project will have third-party stakeholders. Thinking about external third parties, then they can be either suppliers or groups who are impacted by the project. Internal third parties could be other departments or divisions or subsidiaries that are somehow impacted by the project. That impact can be direct or indirect, and it can be caused by either the deliverables of the project or the project execution itself, or both for that matter. In this episode, however, I will focus on external third parties. Let's look at one specific case study. In episode 11, where I talked about the context, I mentioned the example of the subway project in Amsterdam, which at one point in time caused structural damage to a number of houses. Clearly, the owners and inhabitants of these houses were directly and severely impacted by the project execution. These same people could be end users from the point of view of the deliverables of the project. And by the way, I've talked about end users in episode 4 of this podcast and about deliverables in episode 10. Other people living in Amsterdam could be impacted indirectly by the deliverables. For example, if they have a small shop near one of the new metro stations and could see their turnover increase from the flow of travelers passing by their shop. So the impact that the project has on third parties does not need to be negative per se, and third parties who get a positive impact from the project could be turned into champions. In this episode, I will concentrate mainly on external third parties who, at least initially, display a negative attitude towards the project because they are impacted negatively, or they feel impacted, or they care about the impact the project has outside the direct scope and organization. They will behave like pressure groups because of a specific interest that they perceive from the project, and then they could start to organize some counterforce. This could be by lobbying other stakeholder groups in the project, or by mobilizing public opinion, or any form of action that might impact the planned progress of your project. That means that you as a project manager have to deal with such third parties/pressure groups, and preferably in a constructive way. As an example, third parties in the sense of pressure groups can be overlooked because the way they are impacted is a kind of side effect of the project that the sponsor may not have realized from the beginning that would be the case. In one project that I did, there was a production laboratory facility where various high-tech machines were in use. One of the goals of the project was to upgrade several of these machines in order to improve quality of the products. The sponsors had clearly realized that this would involve additional training for the machine operators, and that of course was then part of the project plan. However, it also meant that several tasks that had been manual would be automated. And also the items produced by the new machines would be on average of a quite much higher added value. Also, the items produced by the new machines would be on average of a quite higher added value. As many of the machine operators were labor union members, the union contacted the company management to demand a revision of the labor contracts because of the change of working procedures due to how the new machines needed to be operated, and because of the increased responsibility of machine operators because of the higher added value produced. The employees of the production lab facility had been viewed as end users, which they definitely were. But they were also more than just that. Many were also union members, and the sponsor nor the project manager had realized this, nor that the union might step in as a third party, representing the same people, but now in a different role. The first step in managing third parties is actually knowing who they are. So any project manager must work with her sponsor and other stakeholders to make an inventory of groups or individuals who could be negatively impacted by the project, either by the project execution itself or by the deliverables of the project. This, of course, is very similar to making an inventory of stakeholders, something that every project manager should already do. The next step then is to get to know them better and understand their concerns and interests. Only if you know who they are and what they care about, can you really assess the level of impact that your project might have on them. And that, of course, is necessary if you want to think about your engagement approach. How to involve this third party, how to communicate with them, how to interact with them, how to find a way to avoid them from frustrating the project and turning into a pressure group. The third step is your actual engaging with the third party or third parties. And I want to talk here about a specific approach, maybe it's even a philosophy, for engaging with active third parties or pressure groups. It's called the mutual gains approach. This is a view of negotiation as non-distributive and non-positional. Let me explain. What does non-distributive mean? You can enter negotiations thinking that there is a fixed value to be gained, which then needs to be distributed between the stakeholders. If the one gets more, the other automatically gets less. In game theory, it would be called a zero-sum game. If your approach is non-distributive, then your view is that creative thinking can always find extra value. Not so much cutting up the cake as expanding the size of the cake. And then what does non-positional mean? It's fairly common to see people negotiating with a bicker and shout approach, arguing from a rather fixed position that they think they must defend. But underneath any position or point of view, there are always deeper interests. And so the mutual gains approach is to first focus on finding these deeper interests, and then trying to come up with options and solutions that satisfy these deeper interests, instead of focusing on only the positions that were aired initially. Because it's always possible to find alternatives to a specific position that still meet the deeper interests. The distributive and positional approach often go hand in hand, and people with what you might call a Machiavellian worldview will enter negotiations with this attitude. Because positional negotiation is so common, I think that everyone can remember at least a few situations that they were in where this happened. Here is a quite brutal example from one of my projects. While doing a project in Germany, there were negotiations going on with one of the suppliers of consultancy expertise to the project. Although in his introduction the salesperson was talking about partnership with the client, when it came to discussing specific terms of the proposed contract, and of course prices, he was never looking for common ground, but it was always sticking to a position that he had clearly decided on before entering into the room. Several meetings took place, discussing the same points a few times over, without much progress. In the end, the sponsor from the client organization had to escalate to the boss of this salesperson, and only then did the negotiations move forward. The mutual gains method is based on what is called the Harvard negotiation approach. And that in turn is based on what was learned during police negotiations with hostage takers. So it's definitely rooted in reality and lessons learned there. The core teachings of the Harvard negotiation approach are: 1. Separate the people from the problem. 2. Focus on interests and stakes. Not focus on opinions or positions. 3. Find solutions that serve mutual interests. And 4. Use objective criteria as much as possible, and that means criteria that all the parties can agree to. To achieve all of that, the Harvard approach also describes several techniques. And of course, these are also part of the mutual gains approach. Know what the other party's interests are and actively find out about them. Stimulate what's called joint fact-finding. That means both parties working together to establish the facts of the issue at hand. And oddly enough, or maybe not oddly enough, that's difficult to agree on what are the facts. But it serves to separate the people from the problem, which was the first teaching. Then aim for minimal impact of any proposed solution, or otherwise also think of compensation. Take responsibility and admit errors and share power. Don't try to play the Machiavellian upper hand. Always maintain credibility and trustworthiness. And finally, work to build lasting relationships. And this last point is important, because issues that third parties may have with your project tend to become more complicated if more people and more parties are involved. There is a very strong correlation between successfully handling complex third-party issues and using mutual gains. Underneath the non-positional approach of mutual gains, there is a recognition that human behavior is driven on 3 levels. The most visible is the positions and opinions and points of view. These are the immediate behaviors that you can see. Then below that there is interests and stakes, or the exposure that people feel. And these are drivers for the behavioral patterns that we have. And then at the most fundamental level, there's values and beliefs and norms. These are the cultural background to the patterns of behavior. And these 3 levels help to explain why the techniques that I've mentioned before all focus on getting to know the interests of the other party and working to actively find out. And that technique of joint fact-finding is very helpful in giving parties a better understanding of each other's values and beliefs. Because from experience in the discussions for joint fact-finding, both parties will necessarily reveal bits and pieces of these beliefs and norms and cultural values. And the more you know the other party's values and beliefs, and the better you understand their interests and stakes, the more likely you are to think of creative solutions that benefit all who are involved. And that's simply not possible when everyone just sticks to their positions and thinks they can convince the other by raising the volume. As for me, speaking from the heart, I've never been convinced by anyone just for raising their voice. And I am more likely to cooperate for a shared or a common solution if I get the feeling that the other party understands what drives me, or at least is willing to find out about that. Let's wrap it up. What has been covered in this podcast episode? I've been talking about third parties, describing actually who they are and what they are. I've described 3 steps in managing third-party interests: knowing who they are, understanding their concerns and interests, and actually engaging with them from that perspective of non-distributive and non-positional negotiation. I've described the mutual gains approach for successfully managing pressure groups. And I've characterized mutual gains as non-distributive and non-positional, and summed up the various techniques that make up the mutual gains approach. With so many topics covered, I think you can do with some memory joggers. So please go to projectdoctor.online to download the extra materials with this episode. Subscribe or follow for the podcast so don't miss another episode. And let me know your comments and reviews. I'll be happy to hear from you. Thanks for listening.